When you look at courts and legal treatises, they mention that the surface airspace, this is under state control and state laws, including zoning, but also privacy and torts like trespass and nuisance. And in the surface airspace, all the state and local laws apply to the surface airspace.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 303. Should states and cities get more involved in managing low-altitude airspace? Today's guest believes they should. Brent Skorup is Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. The Mercatus Center is the world's premier university source for market-oriented ideas, bridging the gap between academic ideas and real-world problems. The center advances knowledge about how markets work to improve people's lives by training graduate students, conducting research, and applying economics to offer solutions to society's most pressing problems. In addition to his role as Senior Research Fellow, Brent is also a member of the Texas Department of Transportation's Connected and Autonomous Vehicle Task Force. He has authored several articles for National Affairs, Reuters, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and others. He's appeared on TV and radio for news outlets like C-SPAN, NPR, CBS News, ABC News, and CNBC Asia. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Brent talks about the current federal-centric model governing traditional aviation as it relates to unmanned traffic management. To avoid gridlock with states and the risk of civil suits from landowners, Brent believes the federal government should recognize state and local government authority over drone airspace. But before we explore this idea with Brent, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate. So let's find out why cities and states might want to become more involved in managing low-altitude airspace. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Brent to introduce himself.
My name is Brent Skorup. I'm a Senior Research Fellow and attorney at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I've been working on technology policy, including transportation technology, for 7.5 years at the Mercatus Center. And it's a research center that we've got scholars looking at all areas of policy and regulation, including financial markets and real estate and banking, and I do tech policy.
Brent, how long have you been with the Mercatus Center?
7.5 years at this point.
You recently published a paper called Drone Technology, Airspace Design, and Aerial Laws in States and Cities, which builds on previous research you completed regarding drones.
A year ago, my research assistant, Connor Hayland, we put out a report that ranked all 50 states on their drone readiness. The idea behind the state rankings is some states are ahead of others when it comes to drone policy, and I think we'll talk about some of that. We assign scores based on how ready a state is, and we look at things like the number of drone jobs in the area, whether they have a drone task force or a drone program office in the Department of Transportation, and things like airspace leasing and issues of trespass, and just how conducive those are to drone services.
Why write this paper? What was the impetus behind another research project?
So the paper that just came out, I talk about the history of low altitude airspace or surface airspace, the law and history behind it. And the impetus for it is that there's a few things. So drones, as your listeners know, are maturing very rapidly. Probably familiar with the company Zipline. They've been doing medical deliveries to dozens of hospitals in Ghana, Rwanda for years. They've done 90,000 deliveries at this point, fairly extensive drone delivery network. They just got approved in the past few months to do some delivery services in the U.S., in North Carolina and Arkansas. Just another example of how quickly this is moving. Drone Up, which is a drone company, and UPS this summer took a college campus, a vacant college campus in Virginia, to simulate a local town that they were doing delivery in. Within 48 hours, they were doing deliveries, drone deliveries, every 3 minutes. And to me, it's just a testament of how quickly this technology is. The problem, the obstacle that my paper talks about is how do drone operators gain access to airspace? And this has been an issue that has simmered for a long time. Who regulates low altitude airspace? Is it the federal government? Is it state governments? Is it cities? And what role do private property owners have? And so my paper untangles that history and that legal history behind surface airspace, because the legal issues are different than, say, traditional aviation.
Is there a generally accepted definition for low altitude airspace?
There is some uncertainty here, which is partly why I wrote the paper, and others, I should say, are writing in this area. So below 500 feet above the ground. And that's because there are federal regulations. Navigable airspace is, generally speaking, above 500 feet above the ground. And so I'm looking at the airspace below current navigable airspace, but where drones will be flying. And it presents novel legal issues because you're dealing with things like trespass and nuisance and privacy that you're really not dealing with above 500 feet.
What are some of the findings of your research?
One thing I highlight in the paper is that there has been for 150 years, I would say, there's been a distinction between surface airspace, the focus of my paper and where drones will be flying, and non-surface airspace, high altitude airspace, I guess. There's always been this legal distinction. And surface airspace, if you look at the history of property law and property lawsuits, surface airspace is treated much like real property, where you have issues of trespass, where you can sell, subdivide, and lease airspace, the surface airspace. And it's very unlike the high altitude airspace, where you really don't have this ability to lease and subdivide it, and there's no trespass, for instance. But surface airspace has been treated very differently, and I trace this to court cases in the mid-1800s, in legal treatises, and trace it all the way up to the present day, where you have this distinction between surface airspace, which is treated like real property, and non-surface airspace.
How do local zoning laws factor into the discussion of surface airspace? When
you look at courts and legal treatises, they mention that the surface airspace, this is under state control and state laws, including zoning, but also privacy and torts like trespass and nuisance. And in the surface airspace, all the state and local laws apply to the surface airspace, including zoning. And I mentioned the history of kind of airspace markets, which came about a century ago when you had high rises and cities started imposing setbacks and height limits and these other things. And you saw the development of condominium laws and airspace leasing. So yeah, it gets to that point, which is states and cities and the federal government have always treated surface airspace as very different. And this is very relevant for drones. And how do we integrate drones into the surface airspace? And my paper talks about some of the legal obstacles, but also some possible policy solutions.
Can you talk about some of those solutions?
One impetus for this paper is the fact that it's not clear where drones can fly. And when you realize that surface airspace is different, it is treated like surface property or like land where there is trespass and nuisance. And that raises the question, well, how do we get a drone industry? How can they fly given this? And one proposal I make in the paper is that private landowners aren't the only landowners. There are public landowners like states and cities, including states and cities own the easements and often own the real property for roadways and the public rights of way, including the airspace. And 20 or 22 states, in fact, have airspace leasing provisions. They allow airspace leasing above public roads. And these airspace leasing provisions were put in state law decades ago. They were meant for real estate, like building high rises above roads. But these would also apply. You could also lease airspace to any private company, including drone operators. So that's one proposal, which is if you want to avoid private property and all the issues that come with that, including unconstitutional takings, litigation, create these drone corridors above public roadways and lease them out. And I know of at least 2 states, Utah and Ohio, who are looking at this corridor idea. And I think in part they want to avoid all the issues that come with allowing drones above private property, which I think and you are seeing litigation. Something I'll note, it seems to me many of the large drone operators and many at the FAA don't believe states and cities should have any role to play when it comes to drones. And the longer they avoid this topic, the worse it is for the industry. There needs to be some devolution of authority to states and localities because of the legal issues that I point out in the paper. And airspace leasing is a way of protecting private property, protecting privacy, but also allowing drone operators to have millions of miles of airspace to use.
Who should be taking the lead in managing low-altitude drone operations? Is it a local thing, a state, federal agencies, or private industry?
Yeah, all the above, certainly. I think states and cities will be the primary drivers of this. And actually, you're already seeing this. And this was, I think, a shock to many in the industry, this federal court case that came down a few weeks ago, NPPA versus McCraw. This was a federal case in Texas. Texas, like many other states, created drone no-fly zones above sensitive infrastructure, things like jails and utility lines and schools. They created drone no-fly zones in the surface airspace above them. They were sued by some drone operators, and drone operators claimed in litigation that states and cities are preempted by the federal government, that only the federal government can create drone no-fly zones. And this sat for a year in litigation, and a few weeks ago, the federal court dismissed with prejudice these arguments from the drone operators that only the federal government can create drone no-fly zones. And once you know the history here, it's not very surprising, but I think it is a shock to many in the industry who were hoping that courts would say it's preempted, that only the federal government can regulate drone operations. And it's just not the case under current law. And so I think states and cities will lead this. And that said, you need FAA buy-in. You need FAA collaboration with this because you are dealing with airspace at the end of the day. Drone flights near airports and heliports, do raise safety issues where you need FAA involvement. But I hope this will be a friendly collaboration. In fact, this came out, Government Accountability Office, which advises Congress in a report a few months ago, noted that the U.S. DOT, Department of Transportation, and the U.S. DOJ are creating federal policy. They're going to announce a federal position on this issue of surface airspace regulation. And so I'm waiting eagerly for this and many in the industry as well.
What you're talking about only comes into play when drones have to fly across property lines. A drone operator monitoring a construction site and staying within their property lines wouldn't be concerned.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the world I envision and the world I propose in the paper, which is private property owners would retain their control of surface airspace and presumably could fly drones pretty freely at a low altitude above their land. But for those companies and for those operators who want to do long distance services, either fly high enough where there's no nuisance or trespass issues, or at low altitudes use the public corridors that are managed by state, local, and in some cases federal authorities. Use those public rights of way that we already have.
Did the research look at how helicopters fly in low altitude airspace and the rules that they're subject to?
Generally speaking, navigable airspace is above 500 feet. As I said, there are some exceptions like helicopters, helipads on hospitals, for instance, and even in some agriculture, spraying applications, planes and helicopters are at low altitudes. And that is something that drone operators need to accommodate. What I envision is the FAA whitelisting large areas where there is no interference or de minimis interference to manned aircraft, and then states and cities within those whitelisted areas demarcating and leasing out aerial corridors above the rights-of-way.
How should cities and states proceed if they want to get involved in this area? Should they just start putting markers to a map and drawing out corridors?
Probably not tomorrow, but I think they should definitely be exploring this. And I mentioned Utah and Ohio are exploring this idea of drone corridors above public rights-of-way, and I expect other states will follow suit because you avoid all the litigation and takings issues. So I think they can start preparing for that. And in my state report card, and we have a version 2 coming out next week, we recommend that states do create these drone program offices within their departments of transportation or a drone task force. And 11 or so states have a drone program office or a drone task force. And I think it's a great thing for a state to do to build up their competency and familiarity with these issues. On the airspace leasing particularly, it depends on the state. Actually, California, for instance, they have an airspace leasing division within their Department of Transportation. They're not doing drones at the moment, but there are states that have these competencies already, and it would be adding drones to the picture. In other states, you would be starting from the ground up and building a team. But this is not unheard of. States do lease public property all the time, real estate, but also things like timberlands and offshore oil leases and that sort of thing. So there are some competencies there, but they would need to expand to cover drones and airspace leasing.
What are some of the organizational models for managing the low altitude airspace?
Basically, you lease the airspace and to a UTM provider, and they manage all the traffic. You could lease, layer cake fashion. You could lease different slices of airspace to different UTM providers for competitive purposes. I know there are states and cities who are talking about bringing this all in-house. They want to manage it themselves or bring in those capabilities themselves. I'm a little more skeptical of that view. That's a big lift. That's a major IT project for the public sector, but there are different schools of thought on that. Who does the management? Is it in-house with the state or city, or is it contracted out to approved UTM provider?
Are there any examples of where this is working?
Yeah. North Dakota is a model. Zipline is a good example of if a company knows, if they have an exclusive slice of airspace that only they are using, you can have a pretty rudimentary UTM system just because there's just not a lot of complexity in the air. And so I think there's a lot of benefit to that model of these exclusive slices. And then you can have a pretty rudimentary UTM system. And they'll advance over time, of course, but they are pretty capable today.
Then, of course, local governments could add restrictions based on citizen concerns or other issues.
Yeah, I would envision something like that. So there might be time of day restrictions. There might be decibel noise restrictions. There might be weather restrictions. You can operate in gale force winds, for instance. So yeah, I would anticipate those sort of operational, these very specific operational things dealt with at the state and local level.
Is your research resonating within the industry or with policymakers?
Yeah, I've had a good response. I think my first major project in this area was that drone readiness scorecard last year, and that had a great response. And this paper furthers that and provides a little more legal history. Yeah, the response has been good. And as I said, there are many, I would say, some of the larger drone operators and some within the federal government who seem to want this issue to go away. They are worried, reasonably about the fragmentation problem of states and cities regulating drones. But the issue and the point of my paper is it's not going away. The law is pretty clear that landowners own surface airspace, and this can't be ignored, especially after the Texas federal case I just mentioned, that states can create no-fly zones, and this issue can't be ignored anymore. And by dusting it under the rug, we're just damaging our own industry, and that federal, state lawmakers and the industry need to come together and work together on this.
And I would imagine that regions that figure this out first will have an edge when it comes to competitiveness.
We saw this somewhat with autonomous vehicles, and I don't know closely follow autonomous vehicle policy, but you did see states competing to have autonomous vehicle companies come to their state. Florida is one of them where they competed. They want those jobs. They want that innovation. They want these new services to come to their state. And I hope something similar will happen for drones. I'm a believer in this technology. I think it has a lot of public benefits, not just delivery services, but agriculture inspections and other areas. So there's a jobs component, this airspace leasing, there's a revenue component for states and cities. And I hope there will be competition among states to grow their homegrown companies, but also to bring large companies to their jurisdictions.
For you, what's been the most interesting aspect that you've uncovered as a result of the research?
So I actually came at this from the opposite perspective. When I started doing this research a few years ago, I found compelling the point that we shouldn't have fragmentation of state and local jurisdiction. And by researching the law, my view changed. For practical and legal reasons that I lay out in the paper, unless there's a revolution in the courts, states and cities will have a role to play, and private property owners will have a role to play when it comes to drone operations. That doesn't happen often for a researcher where your mind is changed, where you go in with a certain view and come out with a different views. So that was interesting. This history, I think, is fascinating. It's not been told as far as I can tell. And I'm finding other academics work in this area who have, like me, are somewhat alarmed that this issue has not been resolved. And the industry is rapidly maturing, but we still don't know who manages this low altitude airspace. And so I'm excited by it, and I hope people will check out the paper.
Is there anything that we missed that we should talk about?
In traditional aviation, courts have developed a rule that manned aircraft that fly above private property and below 500 feet are trespassing, that there is a trespass, even for quick transiting flight. That rule is 500 feet, and courts apply it pretty much mechanically. I'm not sure 500 feet is right for drones, just because they're much quieter, and just for a lot of reasons, it's difficult for them to fly above 500 feet. So I proposed for courts that if Congress doesn't act, that courts would find a trespass for drones that are below 200 feet and above private property. And the purpose of that is to bring some certainty to this area, because right now drone operators don't know at what height a trespass is, and landowners also don't know. And I explain some reasons for that in the paper. But if Congress doesn't act, I hope courts will bring a little more certainty to this area.
And again, who has jurisdiction in regard to trespassing?
It's a state law, generally. In that 1946 Cosby case where an airplane was flying at low altitudes, the Supreme Court looked to state law to determine if there was a trespass. So at least historically, courts will look to state and local law when determining if there's a trespass, and drone operators need to be cognizant of that.
How does the FAA deal with trespass laws? Or does it?
The FAA has mentioned it in Part 107, somewhat offhand. They note that there are issues of trespass and privacy at play when it comes to drones, but the FAA notes correctly this is a state and local issue. But that leaves open the question, well, where can we fly and at what heights can we not fly? And my paper attempts to bring some rigor to that, and namely through this idea of using public rights of way, allow drone operators to use that airspace access, that public airspace. Then we can all avoid the litigation and threats of litigation by flying over private property.
Who would be most interested in learning more about your research?
I have a few audiences in mind for the paper. I hope those who are skeptical of this drone federalism idea, I hope they'll take it seriously. The USDOT and USDOJ are taking this up, and we'll learn what their view is shortly. But as I point out in the paper, this can't be ignored any longer, and I hope the federal government and state governments will start rowing together on this. For state governments, I hope state and local lawmakers will realize that they will have a role to play, and a pretty substantial role to play when it comes to drone operations, and that to prepare themselves for it, they can do some things now, like creating a drone program office, which several states have done, like creating a drone task force, and exploring these ideas of what's the appropriate trespass rule? Should there be aerial corridors above public rights of way, and what restrictions? And my final audience was for courts, and this idea of bringing certainty to aerial trespass and this 200-foot line, which I think is a good compromise.
What else is in the works? What about last year's readiness survey? Any plans to update it?
We are updating the 50-state report card that we put out last year about drone readiness. January 14th is scheduled to come out, and I hope your listeners will check that out. We rank all 50 states based on their drone readiness like we did last year, although we have some updated laws, updated policies that we've incorporated, so that the rankings have changed somewhat.
And for my final question, Brent, what message would you like to leave regarding the future of drones and airspace?
In short, I'm an optimist. I think we will have extensive drone services in the next 10 years. And I'm hopeful that once federal government, state governments are working together, we'll have a world-leading drone industry. And so I hope Bridges will take that away.
That's it for episode 303 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Brent Skorup of the Mercatus Center and learning about the challenges and opportunities of managing low-altitude airspace. I want to thank Brent for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the Mercatus Center or want to connect with Brent, check out the website at mercatus.org. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.